Okay, so you've made the decision to effectively replicate the previous experiment and put both of these species on the same island, but without the predator. And we're going to track that population over time, a little bit longer than we did in the previous experiment. We're not going to focus on population size here. We already know what's going to kind of happen. What we're going to focus on is how these two species are using the environment on that island. What we see is when, for example, the green anole is by itself, so we have a control series of islands where we've just put one species on there. We find that the perches that these particular lizards choose to hang out on stay stable. It's around 6 centimeters, half a meter off the ground. These are arboreal lizards after all, so that's to be expected. But when you put two species together, we find that both the green and the brown anole are partitioning up that environment a little differently. And specifically, the green anole is actually being pushed out of the lower branches higher up into the shrubs. So it's going from about half a meter right up to over a meter height in terms of its position in the environment. And we saw in the previous experiment that competition, the brown anole was the better competitor. And you see that the brown anole is just hanging out where it always hangs out. So the green anole is being pushed out of its preferred niche. So this is an example of resource partitioning. The green anole is moving away from the brown anole to reduce competition for the spatial resource of hanging out on these shrubs. Now let's follow this a little bit further. Have a look at the consequences of that green anole moving further up into the more spindly branches of those shrubs. What we find is that after many years, several generations down the track, we find that the toe pads, the size, the area of those toe pads, and the structure of the toe pads themselves has actually changed. It's adapted, and it's adapted because those lizards are now using a slightly different microhabitat, those spindly branches. And this is an example of character displacement. The character here is toe pad area, and the displacement is increasing toe pad area and the structure of those toe pads that allows these lizards to cling on to those branches a lot more effectively. So character displacement occurs over time. So for example, we have competition. So two species coming in together, they're using the same resources and consequently have the same phenotype. And as a consequence of competition, we call an evolutionary wedge pushing these two populations, or at least one of those species, to diverge, first of all, in its resources, and then second of all, as a consequence of using slightly different resources, it's adapting, becoming more specialized to that change in the resource. So that's over time. It also happens over space. So a widely distributed species comes into contact with an ecologically similar species, and at the boundary of that contact, we find character displacement pushing those two species to again diverge in resource use, remembering to reduce the competition, and as a consequence of that, adaptation occurring in the morphology or whatever it is about the phenotype that allows those species to use that resource. It diverges, and as a consequence of the partitioning of the resources. Okay, so you made your choice. Now, what I'd like you to do, if you haven't done so already, is click on the alternative option to see what the outcome is. And this is important so that you can see all the consequences of what we're talking about in terms of competition in this lecture. Alternatively, if you've just seen your option and you would like to see it again because it wasn't too clear, feel free to do so. But if you found that you've seen both of those options now and would like to proceed on for the rest of the lecture, you can do so as well.